Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog, and today we're going to talk about how to rescue dropped stitches in your knitting, like this one that I dropped right here. We're going to look at 3 different scenarios. First, I'll talk about how to pick up a dropped stitch when it just happened in this last row and nothing has had a chance to unravel yet. Next, I'll talk about what happens if you dropped a stitch in the last row but the stitches have started unraveling and laddering down the column. And finally, we'll look at a worst case scenario where maybe you dropped a stitch a few rows back and didn't notice it, kept knitting, and the stitch has already started unraveling down the column. I'll include links in the video description below to each section so you can fast forward ahead to the topic that you want to see. A few materials that can be helpful when you're fixing drop stitches, if you correct them fast enough, sometimes all you'll need is the knitting needles that you're working with. If things go a little bit farther, sometimes it's helpful to either have a crochet hook or a knitting needle that's the same size or smaller than the needles that you're working with. And in this case, I'm using Addi Duets because they have the crochet hook on one end and the DPN on the other, so I can fix my mistakes. And the last thing that can be really helpful when you're picking up dropped stitches is a locking stitch marker. First, let's look at a dropped stitch that happened in the last row, but nothing has unraveled down this column yet. This is the easiest kind of dropped stitch to fix, and you really don't need any sort of special tools to fix it, just your knitting needles that you're using. We need to get this stitch back up onto our left needle so we can continue knitting across our row. And we're going to use our right needle tip to do that. And at this point, it doesn't really matter how you get that stitch onto your right needle tip. You just want to make sure that the right needle tip goes right through the center of the stitch. And it doesn't matter which side you come in from. Whatever is easiest, just get it up on that right needle tip so that it doesn't unravel anymore. Once the dropped stitch is safely up on your right needle, then we need to transfer to the left needle and make sure that it's mounted properly. And what I mean by that is every stitch has 2 legs, a right or leading leg and the left or trailing leg of the stitch. Generally, it's conventional to have the leading leg or the right leg of the stitch at the front of the needle towards you. So let's make sure our stitch is mounted properly as we transfer it from right to left. If I open up the stitch a little bit to look at it, you can see right now that the left leg or the trailing leg of the stitch is here at the front of the needle, and the right leg or the leading leg is at the back of the needle. I need to twist that so that the leading leg is at the front of the needle. So as I transfer it, I'm just going to turn it. And now we can see that this right leg or the leading leg is at the front and the left leg or the trailing leg is at the back. And we're ready to continue knitting. Next, let's look how to fix a stitch that was dropped in that last row. But instead of catching it right away so that you can get it up onto your knitting needles, perhaps it started unraveling and laddering down the column, which looks a little bit trickier to fix, but it's not that bad. The first thing you want to do if you see a stitch that's unraveling is grab a locking stitch marker and get it through the center of the stitch so that it can't unravel anymore. And if it's going to be a while till you fix it, you might want to lock that stitch marker in place. Now, no matter what happens, the stitch can't unravel any further down before you get a chance to fix it. When a stitch has unraveled and laddered down like this, fixing it is easiest if you have a crochet hook that's about the same size as your knitting needles. Today, I'm going to be demonstrating on how to fix this on the knit side of a stockinette stitch swatch. I'll also include a link in the video So, because I have another video that shows how to correct mistakes down a column, both knit-wise and purl-wise. So to get started, we need to basically re-knit these dropped stitches. And what that means is we're going to work strand by strand up this ladder of stitches from the lowest strand to the top of the strands, and pull the stitches through from the purl side of the stitch to the knit side. So the first thing I'm going to do is insert my crochet hook through from the knit side to the purl side, and then unlock the hook, or unlock the locking stitch marker rather. Once my hook is through that stitch, again, it still can't unravel any further, and I want to go up this ladder strand by strand and pull these through knitwise. So I'm pulling the stitch through from the purl side through to the knit side of the stitch. So I start on the lowest strand, go up to the next strand, and then go up to the top strand. And once all the stitches have been picked back up, I need to transfer this top stitch back onto my left needle so I can continue knitting. And again, you just want to be careful about your mounting and make sure that the leading leg of the stitch is at the front of your left needle. So I'm going to go through the stitch, and here is the right leading leg of the stitch is at the front of my knitting needle. And now that it's back up on my needle, I am ready to continue knitting along. Now we're going to look at the worst case scenario for drop stitches. I dropped a stitch down here and didn't realize it, and I kept knitting my work. And then maybe I got a little bit panicky, or maybe my project got shifted around in my project bag. So not only do I have dropped stitches, but they also started unraveling on me down this column. There's no need to fret. This can be fixed. The first thing we're going to do is grab our locking stitch marker and get it through that lowest loop so that nothing else can unravel on us. Now, this is going to be kind of a two-step process to fix things. First, we need to work up these stitches that have unraveled down our ladder. To do that, it's just the same as before. We're going to get a crochet hook that's about the same size as our knitting needles, and one by one work through those rungs and pull them back through. So my crochet hook is going to go right through the center of my stitch. I can remove the stitch marker, and we're going to work one by one up the rungs of this ladder and pull the stitches through from the purl side to the knit side. So we picked up the unraveled stitches, but now we need to get this stitch back up to our knitting needles. The problem here is that there are no stitches to pick up. All we have is these tiny horizontal bars that are between the two columns of stitches. So here's one column of stitches, here's the other column of stitches, and we want to pick up these tiny horizontal bars that are between those two columns. Now it's really handy to have a crochet hook that is smaller than your knitting needles, because there's not much room to work in here and to grab these horizontal strands. So I'm going to switch, and I'm going to use a smaller crochet hook now. So I'm going to take my larger one out. I'm going to insert my smaller crochet hook, and just like before, we want to pull our stitches through from the purl side of our work to the knit side, and we're going to pull these horizontal strands that are between the two columns on either side of what we dropped. So it can be a little bit tight to get in here and a little bit tricky to work, but there's the first horizontal bar. We're going to pull it through from the knit side to the purl side. Find the next horizontal bar and pull it through from the purl side to the knit side. And one by one work up these horizontal bars that are in between the two columns that were on either side of our dropped stitch. And you just want to make sure that you're getting every single one of those horizontal bars. There's the top one. Pull it through. And now we need to transfer this stitch back onto our left knitting needle. Again, making sure the leading leg of this stitch is at the front and the trailing leg is at the back of the needle. So here's the leading leg of my stitch at the front and the trailing leg is at the back. And now I can continue knitting across my work. And then we're going to take a quick look at the tension of the yarn in those stitches that we just picked up. Now, if we spread out our knitting and take a look, you can see this is the column of stitches that we dropped and we picked up. And the tension in these stitches that are on either side, it's a lot tighter than all of our other knitting. Some of that, depending on your yarn and the size of needles you're using, could work out over a few rows just if you keep knitting. Or what you can also do is redistribute a few rows the length of yarn from the outside back to where those stitches were fixed with a knitting needle. And you'll have to do this probably over every single row that you worked up. So I'm going to start from the outside over here, and I'm going to redistribute some of this length just to get the tension evened out a little. So I'll start over here, one by one, picking up the legs of the stitches, pulling it tighter on this side so that there's some extra yarn that can be at the center there where my stitches were dropped and fixed. And you can see that starts to loosen things up. So now I'm going to bring some more yarn across from the outside back to where those stitches were corrected from the other direction. And this takes a little bit of time and patience to do to get the tension back. But it's, depending on how big the piece is that you're working, it's probably still better than ripping out rows and rows of stitches to fix things. And again, it's still tight there, so you're going to have to do that across every row, is redistribute some of that length of yarn across a few stitches from the outside back towards where you fixed. I hope you enjoyed learning how to rescue dropped stitches in your knitting. And if you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel, The Chilly Dog, on YouTube. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!